Hi everyone. I'd like to read the introduction I've written to an Indian version of the fairy story, Rapunzel. This is how it goes. As a young feature writer for glossy magazines, I crisscrossed the United States in search of the most moving, the most shocking, and the most preposterous stories I could find. These included getting to know the woman who was running the Ku Klux Klan, spending time with the Tennessee congregations who would pass around rattlesnakes during their nocturnal prayer sessions, and visiting a cryonic suspension center in Arizona. Out of all the places I went to and the interviews I did, the one that made the greatest impact on me was with a woman named Linda Block, part of a vigilante sovereign citizen movement who had renounced their passports and driving licenses. Block and her partner went on the run after a stabbing. Eventually, they were confronted in a Walmart car park. In a hail of gunfire, Linda Block shot off the round that killed a serving state police officer. She was sentenced to death on death row at Julia Tutwiler Prison in Alabama. And that's where I met her while writing a piece about women on death row in the United States. I spent hours talking with Linda Block, who was then known as prisoner number Z575. She was calm, collected, and far more educated than the other prisoners I had met on this Alabama's one and only women death row. I need to say that I never felt remorse for Linda Block, and that her crimes and her anti-governmental lifestyle were deplorable in every sense of the word. But I was fascinated by her and by the way she was living in limbo, waiting to be terminated by electric chair. During the time I spent on Alabama's death row, and more particularly sitting on a cheap plastic chair outside Linda Block's cell, I couldn't stop thinking about the fact that I could leave at any time I wished, while she would have to remain in the building until someone flicked the switch. I'm only mentioning this now because almost a decade later, I found myself locked up in a Pakistani torture prison. This time, I was on the wrong side of the bars. I had been doing pre-production for a documentary about the greatest lost treasure in human history, thought to be hidden in caves in the wilds of Afghanistan. My film crew and I were arrested just after the 7/7 London bombings while walking down a residential street in Peshawar on the northwest frontier. Before we knew it, we had been blindfolded, shackled, stripped almost naked, subjected to invasive medical examinations, and locked in solitary confinement cells. The prison itself was known as the Farm, and it was a gruesome place by any standards. Still blindfolded and shackled, I would be taken each night to a torture cell where I would be expected to contradict the statements I'd made on the night before. During those 16 terrible nights and 16 terrible days, I frequently thought of that Alabama death row where I had encountered Linda Block. I was terrified out of my mind, of course. Of course I was. Anyone would be. After all, reality isn't anything like the movies. When you're truly frightened, terrified, right down to the core, your core, the smell of your sweat changes. It stinks like cat pee because, as I understand it, you're sweating adrenaline. The last thing you think of is choke slamming the guard, grabbing his gun, and making a glorious and daring escape. Instead, you curl up into a ball on the floor in your concrete cell and hope for the day when you can look back at the adventure with hindsight. having survived with your life. And as you lie there, numb and paranoid, you try to calm yourself with whatever it takes to reduce the misery and the pain. For me, it was stories. In my book, In Arabian Nights, I described how I projected every story I could think of over the movie screen in my mind. I told and retold myself tales from the 1001 Nights and from Anta wa Abla, from the Brothers Grimm, and from the treasury that is Hans Christian Andersen. And as I told the stories over and over, I found myself fixating on anyone who had spoken the tales to me rather than me reading them in books. Locked there in that solitary, bleak prison cell with nothing for comfort but a flea-infested blanket, I delved deep into my memory and imagination. As I did so, one story and its teller kept coming back to me. A few weeks before ending up behind bars in Pakistan, I had been across the border in northern India. While minding my own business in Old Delhi, perched on a chair at a street-side cafe, a hunched figure with a glorious handlebar moustache approached. As his shadow neared my table, I motioned with a hand. "No, thank you," I said instinctively. "I don't want it." "But sir, I am not selling today," the man replied. "Then I have no change to give you," I said. "Not wanting any change, sir," said the man. I peered up from my newspaper. Pinching a fingertip and thumb together, the man preened the corners of his moustache. "Then what is it you want?" "To tell you something." "What?" "A story." "What story?" "A story that will be sucked up into your head and will be waiting there for a quiet moment." "And what good will your story do?" I asked him. Again, the moustache was preened. Then the lips below it pursed open and the mouth began to speak.